Hello everyone and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more exciting content. Today we'll be looking at the inspirational story of Mr. Shaun Attwood that's sure to tug at your heartstrings. Mr. Shaun Attwood led a double life in charge of a US drug empire, but the Manchester's clubber's dramatic downfall nearly saw him face 200 years in jail. Mr. Shaun Attwood, born 28th of October 1968, is an English former ecstasy trafficker turned YouTuber, speaker, activist and author. Born in Widnes, Mr. Attwood became interested in the stock market at age 14, trading for the first time at the age of 16. After travelling to Arizona regularly to visit his aunt, Mr. Attwood moved there and eventually became mired in the bubbling rave scene and distributing ecstasy, smuggling up to £4 million worth of drugs. He was arrested in 2002 and released in 2007 and was deported back to England. Following his release, Mr. Attwood became a speaker and author, chronicling his experiences in prison. His story was featured worldwide on National Geographic Channel as an episode of Locked Up Abroad called Raving Arizona. Random House published his life story as English Shaun Trilogy. Since his first book Hard Time was published in 2011, Attwood has authored books on his life and other topics. Mr. Attwood was born in Widnes, Lancashire, now Cheshire, in a middle-class household, which he has described as loving. Widnes was a chemical manufacturing town, so he didn't grow up with much money. After watching several films mentioning stock markets, Mr. Attwood educated himself, with the help of his teacher in economics, on trading stocks by reading the Financial Times at 14. When he was 16, during the privatisation of many public companies under the Thatcher government, Mr. Attwood attempted to invest in British telecommunications. After inquiring with his father, a Labour supporter who disagreed with Thatcher's government's actions, Mr. Attwood sought money from his grandmother, who supported the Conservative Party, and eventually got £50, which he invested and doubled. He regularly visited his aunts in Arizona, where he became interested in living in the United States. Mr. Attwood attended Liverpool University, studying business studies and graduating in 1990. While attending university, Mr. Attwood began using ecstasy in Manchester rave scenes, which helped him with his anxiety. His inspiration behind his illustrious stock market trading career was a teacher by the name of Mr. Dillian, who taught economics, and he saw that Mr. Attwood was interested in it and he started to give him classes on his own. They would read the Financial Times and he would explain what all the numbers meant. It's like learning a foreign language, and Mr. Dillian just took time to help and made him learn the basics of that language. Mr. Attwood had a couple of aunts who lived in Arizona. He used to visit them when he was a teenager, coming from the north of England where the sun is never shining and it's all rain. So in the Arizona desert where it's so warm and everybody's really happy when they hear your accent, that made him want to move out there in 1991. He wanted to be an investment analyst, but in Arizona all the jobs were stock market jobs, so that's what he did to get his foot in the door. In the beginning there was lots of cold calling. He had to call 500 people per day. He had to be in the office every morning at 6 AM for sales meetings, and he worked very long and stressful hours. Mr. Attwood enjoyed it until he got burned out. Then he saw the potential of making money from ecstasy. He was worth $2 million in the stock market, but he wasn't getting all that much attention. So, going from being nobody in the UK to suddenly throwing rave parties for thousands of people, he got all these people working for him selling ecstasy, got his own bouncers. All that stuff was more addictive than the drugs. It's his ego. His ego was as big as the Grand Canyon back then. As Mr. Attwood began to organise larger parties with his money, he started purchasing and eventually distributing large amounts of ecstasy. This gradually turned into an empire, with Mr. Attwood buying pills from the Netherlands to bypass traffickers in Los Angeles. His operation became associated with the New Mexican Mafia, which offered protection following a night of partying where Attwood's associates helped a brother of a New Mexican Mafia member with hiding from the police. Allegedly, his main competitor in the ecstasy market was Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, a mafia mass murderer and former underboss of the Gambino crime family. Mr. Gravano's new crew members attempted to kill Mr. Attwood and many of Mr. Attwood's associates, which caused him to stop dealing and give up distributing. Retreating to his then girlfriend's apartment and living off money earned during his time distributing, In a YouTube video in November 2020, Mr. Gravano said of Mr. Attwood, "I never met him, I never knew him, he's full of shit." In a rebuttal video, Mr. Attwood stated that he had never claimed to have met Mr. Gravano. In a video on his channel called Sammy the Bull Brought Heat to Our Ecstasy Ring, Sit Down with Shaun Attwood, Mr. Michael Franzesi, ex-capo regime of the Colombo crime family, confirmed that Mr. Attwood's Arizona Ecstasy Ring was in competition with Mr. Gravano and that Mr. Franzesi knew about both rings in the late 90s, when they were both active at the time. Attwood estimated that he'd smuggled up to £4 million of drugs into Arizona, including ecstasy, Xanax and ketamine. Evidence had already been collected against Mr. Attwood from his years as an Ecstasy Kingpin, and on the 16th of May 2002 he was arrested at the apartment. Mr. Attwood, who had attempted to cleanse himself of any connections to his previous life as distributor, was caught after 10 witnesses came forward. After serving 2 years in Maricopa County Jail prior to sentencing, Mr. Attwood pleaded guilty for a sentence of 9.5 years and served the balance of his sentence in the Arizona Department of Corrections. Mr. Attwood is banned for life from entering the United States. And while imprisoned, Attwood wrote about his experiences in prison. These accounts were posted online on a blog titled John's Jail Journey to preserve his anonymity. This began to draw international media attention to the conditions that prevailed under Sheriff Joe Arpaio. While incarcerated, Attwood submerged himself in literature, reading over 1,000 books in just under 6 years, including many classics. By studying original texts in psychology and philosophy, he sought to better understand himself and his past behaviour. The parties were like a couple of hundred people in the beginning, but then it went up to a couple of thousand. The biggest one he ever had was with about 10,000 people, and things were going great for a while until the SWAT team knocked on his door. See, in the beginning, Mr. Attwood was just buying pills for him and his friends on weekends. But he wasn't selling them to his friends, he was just giving them to friends. But then he started to see the business potential of ecstasy. The local dealers couldn't get more than 100 pills at a time, so he took a chance, and he drove out to LA. He brought like 1,000 pills at about $12 a pill, and in Phoenix he could sell those for about $25 to $30 a pill. They sold very rapidly, and it was like an experiment that was successful. It just escalated from there. And he started to import from Holland, where he was paying $3 a pill. He would give the tablets to his people in the States for $10 a pill on credit. And he was selling 5,000 pills at a time. And then this guy was selling it to his people at $15 a pill. Then the dealers are selling them in clubs for $25 to $30. So there was this whole structure to the organisation. Mr. Attwood and his third wife, a topless dancer and internet porn star, lived in a mountainside mansion with the likes of McCartney down the road. He travelled everywhere by limo, brought a string of luxury apartments, and at one point was paying hundreds of people to smuggle drugs into the US. He thought I was Mr. Cool, the craziest, wildest party person. He started dealing, and when the local dealers could no longer supply his needs, he found who the main supplier was and arranged to buy 500 tablets from him for $7,000. Before long, he was importing ecstasy from Holland at $3 a tablet and selling it for $10 to his own team of sellers. He would hide it in luggage and all sorts of stuff like computer towers and vitamin bottles and smuggle it through. He would send his employees from Phoenix to Germany or France and then onto a train to Amsterdam and back, and later through Mexico and over the US border. Mr. Attwood went from a recreational user to a drugs kingpin, aided by the New Mexican Mafia, then Arizona's most dangerous criminal organization. His main enforcers were his childhood pal Wildman and G-Dog, a Mexican-American gangster he met at a party. The Arizona police had 10 witness statements. They never caught Mr. Attwood with any drugs, and they never caught him talking about any major drug deals. They did hear him talking about personal use on the phone, and that was it. So it's pretty unfortunate for Mr. Attwood to be charged when he had been pretty much done with trafficking. After Mr. Attwood took the plea deal, he was in the remand jail for 26 months. He was fighting his own case, and as he wouldn't cooperate with the district attorney who did all kinds of dirty tricks. Her final one was when she told the prison system he had a 34-year sentence instead of 9.5 years. So that's how he ended up fast-tracked to the Supermax. In the Supermax, you very rarely get out of your cell. The guards all have on the Darth Vader outfits and the shank-proof body armour. You're allowed out to have a shower every 3 days. They handcuff you to a hole in the door. And they open the door and they say, we're going to walk to the shower, and if you signal to another prisoner or turn your head, we're going to grab you and smash your face into the concrete. Then they leave you in the shower for hours on end, and you can imagine what it's like in there with mould, jizz and insects. Mr. Attwood was exposed to mostly racial gangs in prison. In the case of Arizona, it was the whites, blacks, Mexicans and Mexican Americans. As soon as he went in, neo-Nazi skinheads from the Aryan Brotherhood say, hey, we want a word with you, we can get in that cell. You can't say no, as they are just going to smash you then and there into the wall. So in the cell, they wanted to see his charges. His charges were on a little sheet, on a little printout. He didn't know how to behave in prison, so they almost beat him up. They were okay with his charge sheet as they went on to fine people who were in for sex offences. It is KOS for prisoners who are in sex offences. KOS is kill on sight, and that's how the Aryan Brotherhood earn their tattoos, by killing and beating people up. The media only focuses on extreme crimes. Prisoners who are child molesters, rapists and murderers. But since the war on drugs, most arrests are of young people with weed possessions. The average arrest is a black or Mexican kid with a little bit of weed. It's all about filling these private prisons up to make money off the back of it. People don't care about prisoners because of the media, and they don't understand what's going on inside. The worst thing that Ian knew had happened, he didn't actually see it, but what happened was to one of his friends, Miss Zena. She was gang raped by other inmates multiple times. She was beaten unconscious, and then they shoved things inside of her anus, including a broomstick. She told them that she didn't care if she lived or died anymore. And she came up with an idea, and the next time they tried to rape her, the first guy who put his hand on her, she plucked his eyeball out. She plucked 2 different rapists' eyeballs out, and they left her alone after that. Over 100 people were arrested with Mr. Attwood, including some of his bouncers, so at first, they were protecting him. After they were sent to different jails, he got mafia protection from a guy called Two Tonys. He'd killed a lot of people. He was looking for someone to write his life story, so Mr. Attwood became his official biographer, and he protected him for the almost 6 years that he was in prison. Prison, according to Mr. Attwood, was inherently quite boring. You wake up early, go for breakfast, come back to your cell, do some working out, some reading, some writing, and then you go for your next meal. Depending on your security level at night, they either lock you down again with a head count or just lock you down as normal, and it's the exact same every day. The most dangerous prisoner in Arizona history was a guy named Bonsai. He was like the bogeyman. As a young person, he'd come to prison on a short-term sentence for some burglaries. His real name was Robert Wayne Vickers. One morning, his cellmate didn't wake him up for breakfast, so Robert murdered him. He stabbed him with a shank made out of a toothbrush, and he'd carved the word bonsai into his cellmate's chest, but he spelt it wrong. Instead of B-O, he wrote B-A, and when the guard came and asked why he had killed his cellmate, Bonsai said, because he didn't wake me up for breakfast and he drank my Kool-Aid. Now, he is going back and forth to court as he's murdered someone. He got out of his handcuffs in court, stabs a guard, and ran around the courtroom. He was even escaping out of cells. They put him in a high security prison, and one day he showed his neighbour in the next cell a picture of his niece. The neighbour made a crude sexual comment. Bonsai then built a bomb out of hair care products, and as he was going to the shower, he looked over his neighbour and threw the bomb, and the guy burned to death. The smoke coming from him almost killed all the prisoners in the building, as the jail wasn't very well ventilated. He was considered so dangerous that he was the only prisoner to have a private shower built in his cell, and his cell door was welded shut. The only time that he ever got out again was when they executed him. Mr. Attwood's worst cellmate was a home invader who didn't like him at all. He had a padlock in his sock and he threatened to smash Mr. Attwood's skull when he first met him. After a short time, he managed to get moved. Mr. Attwood managed to keep himself out of trouble thanks to his alliances with certain people, including his pal Peter. Mr. Peter knocked the guy out who asked him what his charges were. No one messed with Mr. Attwood once they knew he was with him. The stress of being on constant edge led Mr. Attwood down to a dark path where he contemplated suicide, but he found solace in a surprise place: reading. During his time locked up, Mr. Attwood read more than 1,000 books. He learnt Spanish and yoga and began writing about his experience, which later became his book trilogy of published memoirs. The English Shaun trilogy consists of Party Time, Hard Time and Prison Time. He has also released a self-help book called Life Lessons. His writing also formed a groundbreaking blog documenting the conditions of the infamous jail, which included dead rats in the food, cockroaches crawling in his ears at night, and inmate murders. He would write on bits of paper which were smuggled out of the jail before being published online in John's Jail Journal. The covert blog he started from behind bars to expose inhumane conditions inside the US jail system has led him to write a book which he hopes will be published later this year. The book will focus on his time at Maricopa County Jail, a strange and unforgiving environment for a middle-class Widnes boy who graduated from Liverpool University with a top-class economics degree. Mr. Attwood then spent 2 years awaiting sentence in Maricopa County Jail, a cockroach-infested hellhole run by the notorious Sheriff Joe Arpaio, where inmates endured starvation and frequently attempted suicide. During this time, his fiancée broke off their engagement and, horrified by his surroundings, he started the blog, titled John's Jail Journal, to protect his identity. Mr. Attwood wrote his notes using a tiny blunt pencil stub and paper which was usually soaked in sweat because of the intense heat. He then sent it to his aunties and father, who published the notes on his website. Meanwhile, his parents liquidated their pension and remortgaged their home to pay for a top US attorney, who eventually negotiated a plea bargain sentence of 9.5 years. The online diary tells a disturbing story of life in the Maricopa penal system, before Shaun was moved to a less severe jail. Sheriff Arpaio forces inmates to wear pink underpants, pits women on chain gangs, and brags that it costs more to feed the guard dogs than his prisoners. He thrives on the reputation as America's toughest sheriff, but his hardline tactics have infuriated human rights campaigners. Mr. Attwood spent many a night lying awake worrying. On his first day at Maricopa, he had barely eaten for a couple of days and had started to hallucinate. He was put in a one-man cell with 3 people in it, and if he raised his head from his bunk, it would hit the ceiling. It was squalid with violence happening all the time. The majority of people inside use heroin or crystal meth, and it makes them paranoid. While I was there, I saw loads of race riots and things could kick off at any second. Because he was from England, people thought he was a novelty. He told them that he was from a town near Liverpool where Sporty Spice was from, and they liked that. He was only attacked once by this biker who got at him a couple of hours before a visit from his parents. Meanwhile, Mr. Attwood's blog started to raise eyebrows as his accounts of the pitiful food served to inmates spread around the world. There were 2 meals. One was mouldy bread, which you just scrape the mould off and eat with a raw bologna, and the other was called Red Death, a stew the colour of blood with potato peel. 2 of the lads found rats in their stew. It turned Mr. Attwood into a vegetarian. He is 6 foot and he ended up weighing 10 stone. His parents said he looked like a skeleton. After serving just shy of 6 years of his sentence, Mr. Attwood was released in December 2007 and allowed back to the UK, where he was reunited with his family, who supported him throughout his ordeal. Banned from America for life, Mr. Attwood now lives near London and talks to student audiences across the UK and Europe about his jail experience and the consequences he faced by getting involved in drugs and crime. He has appeared on TV a number of times, speaking about issues affecting prisoners' rights, and also hosts his true crime podcast on YouTube. He has also donated 20,000 of his books to kids in state schools and prisoners. Mr. Attwood continues to maintain his blog, now under his own name, where he publishes letters and accounts sent to him by other prisoners. Having credited books for being the lifeblood of his rehabilitation, Mr. Attwood spoke out in outrage on the Right Stuff at the ban on sending books to UK prisons introduced by Justice Minister Chris Grayling. Having left prison in 2007, it took nearly a year for Mr. Attwood to adjust to contemporary life. He was a bit institutionalised, and it took a year of living at his parents' house before he could move to London and get all of his work stuff going. He was happy to be free, but the rules he lived by in prison don't work in society. Mr. Attwood now gives talks to school children and other groups about the negative consequences of crime and drugs, and he advocates against Sheriff Arpaio and his methods. Shaun has given several TEDx talks on his experiences. The University of St. Gallen in Switzerland hosted his 3rd of December 2016 talk on what facing 200 years in prison taught him about happiness. He has also appeared on BBC, Sky News, CNN and TV in over 40 countries worldwide to talk about issues affecting prisoners' rights. After appearing on the True Geordie podcast, Mr. Attwood started his own true crime podcast and has a YouTube channel that has reached 650 to 100,000 subscribers on 19th of January 2021. He answers questions about what prison was like, and he interviews true crime guests and retells stories of what happened during his time in prison. Mr. Shaun Attwood has conducted several interviews and has written on the case surrounding the underage sex trafficking ring around Jeffrey Epstein, and has interviewed conspiracy theorist Mr. David Icke regarding the September 11th attacks and the Epstein case. Reading was the lifeblood of his rehabilitation. He had addiction issues and he didn't understand that he had been self-medicating with street drugs, and by reading philosophy and psychology texts, they forced him to look inside himself and address the root causes of his addiction, and do all the inner work that was necessary, and build up tools so that when he got out, he wouldn't be drawn to that addictive behaviour. His experience in prison was therefore the education opportunity of a lifetime for him. Mr. Attwood strongly believes that if you put people in an environment where they treat people like animals, where the threat of violence makes you feel continually under stress every day, where you aren't getting sunshine, you aren't getting proper food, then your stress goes through the roof. When he first got to prison, he couldn't sleep for the first few days because his heart was beating out of his chest. So people, especially people dealing with the stress of a long sentence, turn to the hardest drug possible so they don't have to deal with it and get out of their minds. In Arizona, there was no attempt to rehabilitate prisoners at all. The guards were selling drugs to prisoners, and it only takes 1 or 2 guards to flood the whole prison with drugs. Drugs laws have corrupted everything. They have corrupted the police, the prisons, the guards. It's inescapable. In the UK and the US, prison rules and procedures are used as a carrot and stick to govern behaviour. If a guard doesn't like a prisoner, they will threaten them with a urine test, knowing full well that the prisoner will test positive for heroin or something else and they will lose their privileges. So because of that, many harder drug users are swapping to newer drugs like spice, which are harder to test for than cannabis, and they stay in the system for a much shorter time. In America, it has changed slowly because so many people were arrested for weed, and there was a backlash against criminalisation at the state level. When you have a kid calling home saying, "Mum, I just got caught with some pot and I'm in prison with a cellmate who has a padlock and a sock who's threatening to rape me. I need $10,000 to get out on bail. I need a lawyer." That's when people start to wake up, and the federal government has cannabis set as a Schedule 1 substance. But people at the state level have gone against that, demanding reclassification for cannabis. So in terms of cannabis, there has been a change of heart, and even people like Mrs. Hillary Clinton are now saying they will take cannabis down to Schedule 2, riding that wave of popular opinion. With heroin, there's a popular opinion that users are causing crime, shoplifting, robbing houses, etc. However, in his hometown Widnes in the late 80s, where they ran a pilot scheme to help provide heroin to addicts, crime stats collapsed. They had shops pitting up money to keep the program going, and there were plans to roll it out nationally. The DEA got wind of it, and there was a call to Downing Street and the whole thing closed down. One of the things he teaches to schools are life lessons, and one of these lessons is learn a relaxation technique. From his own experience, he had to try and deal with all the built-up stress from his days as a stockbroker with drugs. And obviously that led to a very self-destructive ups and down cycle, where he got to prison, dealing with the awful conditions, facing a 200-year maximum sentence. It became like a vice that forced him towards medication. At first it was impossible to slow down my thoughts, as prison conditions were so hectic. However, the medication soon started to bear fruit. Mr. Attwood had created a successful YouTube channel, however it was removed by YouTube, and then reinstated, to be removed again, only to be reinstated a second time with an explanation from YouTube that his channel had been removed by the algorithm, and once it had been reviewed by a human, it was re-uploaded. Mr. Attwood has helped many people gain a following of their own, off the back of his own platform, and is always willing to help new and up-and-coming people who are interested in sharing their own story or creating their own YouTube channel. Mr. Attwood is a very important person in the UK criminal underworld, but not for the crimes that he's committed in the UK, but for the fact that he has helped, or at the very least inspired others, even if it's under the mentality of I'm a bigger gangster or I can do a better job, to share their own story about crime to the younger generation, so that the younger generation can learn from the mistakes that the older ones made. What are your opinions on the crimes committed by Mr. Attwood? Do you believe Mr. Attwood's channel was removed because of the sensitive issues that he was talking about, or was it just a mistake by the YouTube algorithm?
Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and a share, and leave any thoughts or suggestions you have in the comments section. We love to read through them all. And if you're new but enjoy UK true crime content, then subscribe to see when our newest video releases. And as always, stay safe.